Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to try to unpack what might be lurking in your mind, or at least
Yeah.
how we've come to understand those things. The complexities of what we now call psychological disorders.
Mm.
We're diving into some excerpts from a psychopathology textbook chapter,
Okay.
which, might sound a little dry at first, but trust me, there are some real gems in here.
Yeah.
Thinking like wandering uteruses and snake pits.
Wow.
We'll get to those.
It's amazing how much our understanding of this stuff has evolved over time.
Right.
And how some ideas that seem so outlandish to us now were once, totally accepted explanations.
If I told you your melancholy was caused by an imbalance of black bile, you'd probably suggest I get my head checked.
Right.
But that's where we're starting, to see how we got to where we are today.
Yeah.
So first up, how do we even define a psychological disorder?
Well, the textbook gives us 3 key criteria:
Okay.
psychological dysfunction, distress, or impairment, and atypical or culturally unexpected responses.
So using the textbook's example of Judy, who faints at the sight of blood,
Okay.
we can see all 3, right? She's not functioning, quote-unquote, normally when it comes to blood.
Right.
It's definitely causing problems in her life.
Yeah.
And fainting at the sight of blood isn't exactly a typical reaction.
No, not really.
But you mentioned before that it's not just like a checklist, it's more of a continuum.
Exactly. Think of it like this, plenty of people get a little squeamish around blood.
Yeah.
That's understandable. But where does that squeamishness become a phobia? Something that really disrupts your life, you know? That's where things get a little fuzzier.
Yeah, and then how these things are viewed across different cultures.
Oh, absolutely.
What might be considered odd in one culture could be totally normal in another culture.
Of course.
But how do experts decide, when something crosses that line from a quirky personality trait to a full-blown disorder?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
It's one of the big debates in the field, actually. There's this concept of harmful dysfunction. That brings in this idea of control. Like, is the behavior causing harm, and does the person feel like they can control it? So, if we use that as a measure around, what do you think? Is Judy's reaction out of her control?
It definitely seems like her reaction is involuntary.
Yeah.
But I guess the degree of impairment matters, too.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if she's going out of her way to avoid any situation where she might encounter blood,
Oh,
that's impacting her life.
right. Exactly.
Okay, so defining a disorder isn't as simple as you might think.
Not all.
But how did people even begin to explain these, dysfunctions back in the day?
Well, you alluded to it earlier. Some of those early explanations are pretty out there.
Yeah.
But I guess we can group them into 3 main models:
Okay.
supernatural, biological, and psychological.
Let's start with the supernatural.
Okay.
Cue the spooky music. This is like demons and witchcraft, maybe a bit of astrology thrown in for good measure.
Yeah, exactly. And, for people back then, it was a very real and terrifying way to explain things they just couldn't understand.
Like, it wasn't just an idea, it was real to them.
Totally real. Take King Charles VI of France. They called him the Mad King.
Oh, yeah.
He suffered from what we might now call a psychotic break, even attacked his own knights.
And of course, everyone assumed he was possessed by demons or cursed or something.
Well, some people did.
Right.
But it's fascinating to see that even then there were other points of view.
Really?
Yeah. While some saw his erratic behavior as supernatural, his physician actually believed it was caused by stress and melancholy.
Wow,
Yeah.
so like a more modern understanding was already there.
In a way.
Even back in the 14th century.
Mm.
And how did they treat it? Was it all exorcisms and leeches and stuff?
Well, they prescribed rest, a healthy diet, and a supportive environment.
Wow. So this idea of moral therapy had been around for a while.
Longer than you might think.
That's really amazing. But I can't let us move on without mentioning some of the more creative treatments.
Oh, yeah.
From back then, like the theory of the wandering uterus causing hysteria in women.
Right. It definitely reflects the limited understanding of both biology and psychology that they had at the time.
For sure.
But let's move on from the supernatural
Right.
and talk about the second model, the biological tradition.
All right.
This is where we meet Hippocrates. He believed that mental illness had a biological basis in the brain and could even be influenced by heredity.
So he was basically saying it's not demons, it's your brain chemistry.
Basically, yeah. He was way ahead of his time.
That's huge. But what about his humoral theory? With the black bile and the yellow bile and phlegm?
Right.
That doesn't exactly sound like cutting-edge neuroscience.
No, it doesn't. But you have to remember, this was a revolutionary attempt to connect mental states to actual bodily functions.
I see.
And in a way, it foreshadows modern concepts like chemical imbalances, It's fascinating how these early attempts to understand the mind, though inaccurate, sometimes hit upon these kernels of truth that we're still exploring today.
It makes you wonder what we'll look back on 100 years from now and think, what were we thinking? All right, well, let's jump back to the 19th century. What happened then that further shaped the biological tradition?
Well, the 19th century brought some big breakthroughs. The discovery that syphilis, a bacterial infection,
No.
could cause psychosis was huge. It really solidified the idea that there could be these biological underpinnings to what was previously seen as purely mental illness.
That must have been a game changer.
It was. And then you have John P. Gray,
Yeah.
who really ran with that biological perspective.
He was convinced that all mental illness was physically based, right?
Yeah, he advocated for things like rest diet and good ventilation as treatments.
Which honestly doesn't sound too bad.
Not at all. It was a huge step forward in improving conditions in asylums,
Yeah.
which were often horrific before.
Wow.
He genuinely believed that he was helping, and in some ways he was, but this emphasis on purely biological causes also led to this sense of hopelessness. Like mental illness was incurable.
It's almost like a good intention, but with some unintended consequences.
Exactly. And as hospitals became larger and more impersonal, that personal touch that was so crucial to moral therapy kind of faded away.
So I read that during this time, some surprisingly effective treatments were discovered, but totally by accident.
It's true. Insulin shock therapy and electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, both emerged during this period. And while we've moved away from insulin shock therapy because of the risks, ECT is actually still used today,
Wow.
although we still don't fully understand how it works.
That's incredible. Using a treatment without fully understanding why it works?
Yeah.
Talk about trusting the process. But those weren't the only major medical advances during this time, were they?
No, not at all. The 20th century saw the development of the first effective drugs for psychosis, neuroleptics, and benzodiazepines.
Okay.
These were truly game changers, They offered some relief for people who had very few options before.
Okay, so we've gone from demons and humors to brain chemistry and accidentally discovered treatments. It's been quite a journey.
It has.
But let's pause here for now. We'll be back in part 2 to explore the psychological tradition, the rise of moral therapy, and the world of psychoanalysis. Welcome back to the deep dive. Last time we were traveling through time, looking at some pretty fascinating and sometimes downright bizarre explanations for mental illness.
Yeah, it's amazing how much our thinking has changed.
Right. We went from demons and wandering uteruses to the idea that just maybe the brain had something to do with it.
It was a big shift in thinking.
Huge. And we saw how those early biological explanations, while a step in the right direction, also had some, downsides.
Right, like that sense of hopelessness about the possibility of recovery.
Yeah, like with John P. Gray and his belief that mental illness was incurable. But at the same time, this new focus on biological causes also led to some improvements in the conditions of asylums, which were often pretty dreadful before.
They were.
It's a good reminder that, progress isn't always a straight line.
Absolutely. It's more like a winding road with lots of detours and dead ends along the way.
For sure.
Yeah.
And one of those detours was moral therapy, which sounds like a breath of fresh air after all those snake pits and exorcisms.
It was a huge shift in focus
Yeah.
from punishment and confinement to treating people with kindness, respect, and dignity.
It's like that saying, treat a man as he is, and he will remain as he is. Treat a man as he can and should be, and he will become as he can and should be.
That's perfect. That really captures the essence of moral therapy.
And did it work?
It did. The results were actually quite remarkable.
Really?
Even patients who had been considered incurable, showed significant improvement.
But if it was so successful, why did it decline? Was it just a matter of resources and overcrowding?
Well, those were definitely factors, as the number of patients in asylums skyrocketed.
Right.
It became harder and harder to provide that individualized care.
That makes sense.
But there were also some ideological shifts happening at the same time.
Like what?
Well, think about Dorothea Dix.
Oh, yeah. The advocate for the mentally ill.
Exactly. Her tireless efforts led to the creation of many new institutions.
Yeah, which is a good thing, right?
It was, but ironically, it was this increase in institutions that contributed to a shift back towards custodial care.
Wow, so her success inadvertently undermined the very principles she was fighting for.
Sadly, yes. It's a reminder that even with the best of intentions, things can go awry.
Especially when you have these complex social and economic factors in play.
Exactly.
So moral therapy might have faded, but the idea that the mind itself played a role in mental illness was gaining traction. And that brings us to psychoanalysis and, The enigmatic figure of Sigmund Freud.
Ah, Freud, the man who made the couch a cultural icon.
Right.
Even if you've never read a word of his work, you've probably heard of things like the Oedipus complex or the id-ego and superego.
For sure.
He really left his mark on our culture.
He did. I've always thought of Freud as kind of a psychological archaeologist, trying to excavate these buried unconscious conflicts
Yeah,
that might be driving our behavior.
I like that analogy. It gets at the heart of what Freud was trying to do.
Yeah.
Uncover those hidden parts of ourselves that might be shaping our thoughts, feelings, and actions without us even being aware of them.
Okay, so let's break down some of his key concepts. The id-ego and superego. Those are like the three main characters in the drama of our minds, right?
That's a good way to think about it.
So what's the id?
The id is the impulsive part of us that operates on that pleasure principle.
But like the I want it now part of us.
Exactly. It's driven by our basic instincts and desires.
So the id is that little voice saying, eat the whole cake, stay in bed all day.
Pretty much.
Who cares about responsibilities?
Right. And then you have the superego, which is like our internalized moral compass,
Okay.
the voice of reason and societal expectations. It tells us what we should and shouldn't do.
So it's the voice saying, you can't eat the whole cake, you'll regret it later. Get up and go to work, be responsible.
Exactly.
And then caught in the middle is the poor ego,
Yeah.
trying to balance these demands of the id and the superego with reality.
That's a tough job.
That sounds exhausting.
It can be.
No wonder we developed defense mechanisms.
Defense mechanisms are the ego's way of protecting us from anxiety and distress.
Okay.
Some of them, like sublimation, can be quite adaptive.
Sublimation. What's that?
It's like channeling that negative energy into productive outlets like exercise or art.
So like hitting the gym instead of yelling at your boss.
Exactly. But other defense mechanisms like repression or denial can be maladaptive and lead to more problems down the line.
Right. And of course, we can't forget about Freud's psychosexual stages of development,
Ah, yes, the oral anal phallic stages.
which even just the names make people a little uncomfortable.
They do. But Freud believed that our early experiences during these stages could shape our personalities and even contribute to psychological disorders.
I remember reading about the Oedipus complex, the idea that little boys develop a rivalry with their fathers for their mother's affection.
It's definitely one of Freud's most well-known and controversial concepts.
For sure. And while some aspects of Freud's theories, particularly those related to sexuality, have been heavily criticized, he did make some important contributions to our understanding of the unconscious.
He did. His influence on psychology and even popular culture is undeniable.
Right. And it's not like everyone just threw out all of his ideas. Psychodynamic therapy, which is still practiced today, draws on some of his core concepts.
Exactly. And then there are things like the importance of the therapeutic relationship, which Freud really emphasized.
So while Freud might not be the end-all be-all of psychology, he definitely left his mark. But our exploration of the psychological tradition doesn't end there. Next, we'll explore humanistic psychology with its focus on self-actualization and personal growth. So stay with us. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've gone from ancient explanations of like demonic possession to the depths of the unconscious mind with Freud.
Quite a journey.
It really has. Now let's shift gears to something a little bit more uplifting, humanistic psychology. If Freud was all about, those dark hidden drives, humanistic psychology seems to really shine a light on our potential for, growth and self-discovery.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Thinkers like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, they really shifted the focus from what's wrong with us
Yeah.
to what's right, to our inherent capacity for goodness and self-actualization.
Okay, but we're still talking about psychopathology here.
Right.
So how does this, inherent goodness fit into the picture?
Yeah.
If we're all naturally driven toward growth,
Mm.
why do some of us get stuck?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, humanistic psychologists would say that psychological distress happens when something blocks that natural growth process.
Okay.
It could be challenging life experiences or societal pressures, or even just a lack of unconditional positive regard from the important people in our lives.
Unconditional positive regard. That sounds like a parenting book title.
It does, doesn't it?
But I get it. It's that sense of being loved and accepted for who you are.
Exactly. Flaws and all. Rogers believed that this kind of unconditional acceptance was essential for healthy development.
Okay.
And that therapists should provide it to their clients,
Oh, so those should create that safe space.
A safe and supportive space for self-exploration.
So it's less about, digging into the past like Freud and more about empowering people in the present to become their best selves.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. The therapeutic relationship itself is seen as a healing factor in humanistic therapy.
It makes me think of those inspirational posters with the mountains and sunsets. You know, reach your full potential.
Right.
But did humanistic psychology really contribute much to our scientific understanding of psychopathology? I mean, it all seems a bit fluffy.
It's true that humanistic psychology might not have produced as much empirical research as other approaches.
Right.
But it had a huge impact on how we think about therapy and the therapeutic relationship.
Right.
That emphasis on empathy and genuineness and the importance of subjective experience are still cornerstones of many therapeutic approaches today.
So even if it's not all about, hard science, it helped to make therapy a more human-centered experience.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to the last piece of the puzzle, behaviorism.
Right.
This is where things get a bit more, concrete and measurable.
Exactly. Behaviorism shifted the focus from internal states like thoughts and feelings to observable behaviors, and how those behaviors are learned and modified through interaction with the environment.
So enter Pavlov and his drooling dogs. Classical conditioning is one of those basic principles of learning that has really stood the test of time.
It has. And it's not just about dogs salivating at the sound of a bell. Think about those cancer patients who develop anticipatory nausea at the mere sight of a nurse or a hospital.
Oh, yeah, that's a good example.
Right.
Much less appetizing, though.
Yeah, a little less appealing. But it shows how powerful those learned associations can be.
Yeah, how does something like, neutral, like a person in a uniform become linked to such a strong physical reaction?
It comes down to repeated pairings, you see. The chemotherapy, which naturally causes nausea, gets paired with these previously neutral stimuli, like the nurses, the hospital, the smells. Over time, those stimuli, even without the chemo, can trigger the nausea response.
It's like my cat running to the kitchen every time she hears the can opener, even if I'm just opening a can of beans.
Exactly.
But so are behaviors saying that, like, all of our behaviors, even the dysfunctional ones, are just learned responses to our environment?
Well, it's not quite that simple. While early behaviorists focused almost exclusively on observable behaviors, later approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy took a more nuanced view, incorporating thoughts and beliefs and interpretations into the equation.
Okay, so it's not just about external stimuli controlling us.
Yeah.
It's also about how we perceive and respond to those stimuli.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. But before we get there, let's talk about a couple of the pioneers who helped to shape the field. John B. Watson and his student, Mary Cover Jones. Do you remember the Little Albert experiment?
Oh, yeah, that's the one with the poor kid who was conditioned to be afraid of white rats and eventually anything fluffy and white. Not exactly, a high point for ethical research.
No, it definitely wouldn't be approved today.
Yeah.
But it did demonstrate the power of classical conditioning in shaping even our deepest fears.
Right.
Now, on a more positive note, Mary Cover Jones, using similar principles, showed that fear could also be unlearned.
Okay.
She helped a young boy named Little Peter overcome his fear of rabbits through gradual exposure and positive reinforcement.
So she reversed the conditioning.
In a way, yes.
That's a much better story.
Yeah.
And it sounds like a precursor to modern exposure therapy for phobias.
It is. And then, of course, there's B.F. Skinner and his work on operant conditioning, which is all about how the consequences of our actions shape our future behavior.
Oh, yeah. Rewards and punishments. The classic carrot and stick approach.
Exactly.
But how does this apply to psychopathology?
Well, think about it this way. If certain behaviors like avoidance or social withdrawal are consistently reinforced,
Okay.
even if they're ultimately causing distress,
They're more likely to persist.
So it's not just about those initial learning experiences. It's also about how our behaviors are maintained over time.
Exactly. Through these patterns of reinforcement.
But if we're just products of our conditioning, doesn't that make us feel kind of powerless?
That's where the later evolution of behaviorism into cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, comes in.
Okay.
CBT recognizes that our thoughts and beliefs play a crucial role in how we perceive and respond to the world around us. It's not just about changing behaviors, it's about changing the thoughts and beliefs that are driving those behaviors.
So we're not just, mindless robots responding to our environment. We have the power to change our thoughts, and in doing so, change our lives.
Exactly. We have agency.
That's a much more empowering message. So we've gone from blaming demons to dissecting the brain to understanding the power of learning and the importance of, our thoughts and beliefs. It's incredible how far we've come in our understanding of psychopathology. It really is. And I think the most important takeaway from all of this is that there's rarely a simple explanation. We've moved away from those single cause models and embraced a more integrated approach,
Right.
recognizing that mental health is influenced by this complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors.
Like the biopsychosocial model we talked about before. It's not just nature and nurture, it's both.
And a whole lot more.
Right.
And that complexity, I think, is something to embrace.
How so?
Well, it means that there are multiple avenues for intervention and healing. And it also reminds us that this is an ongoing journey of discovery. What we consider truth today might be revised or refined tomorrow.
It's like that saying, the only constant is change. And that's especially true in the ever-evolving field of psychology.
Well said.
So as we wrap up here, any final thoughts for our listeners as they continue to explore the world of the psychopathology?
Yeah, I'd say remember to question assumptions, stay curious, and be open to new ways of thinking.
And remember, we'll be here to guide you through those fascinating depths. Until next time, happy diving.